Okay, so continuing with these relatively short videos, sort of the idea being that I want to kind of give you all of the sort of main Keynesian arguments. That way, when we turn to the sort of Keynesian criticisms this week, that you'll kind of have the sort of the full arsenal of sort of Keynesian ideas, both the ones that tend to sort of withstand criticisms very well, and then also those aspects that don't. The idea here is that by the end of this week, in terms of sort of the macroeconomic conception of economic fluctuation, sort of short to medium run economic fluctuations, be they sort of negative supply shocks like we saw during the early part of the 1970s and middle part of the 1970s. Drop my pen, hold on. Or whether we're talking about a demand shock like we saw at several points throughout the 20th century, most notably during the Great Depression. So, in a sense, what does all this mean for macroeconomists in 2025? What do the folks who, in a sense, are continuing to take the discipline into ever more innovative territories? What is their, in a sense, stylized facts? That's the way that we really tend to think about these sorts of ideas. Is like, what are these general facts that seem to corroborate, particular economic ideas and particular economic theories? The reason why Keynesian and the sort of neoclassical synthesis of Keynesian ideas has remained the dominant sort of almost like ideological foundation of mainstream macro is not just because macroeconomists latched onto the theory and then never let it go. Keynesianism is probably one of the more challenged ideas, certainly within economics, but probably across most social sciences. And the reason why we keep coming back to sort of these Keynesian ways of thinking, as it were, is because empirically these models tend to do very well. However, we also know that over time that there are things, again, empirically, that will poke holes into the relative plot, perhaps, of Keynesianism at particular times. But even if not, they give us, in a sense, a foundation of potential criticism, which I think is important. Even if empirically the Keynesian models still look very good, I think it's good to know in which ways they will likely fail in the future, I think is sort of the idea here. So again, by the end of this week, you really should have a really good idea of where macro has been and arguably where it is today, at least in terms of kind of an intermediate level conception of that. Regardless, to sort of jump into what I want to do in this video, which again should be a relatively short one, is I want to kind of go over another sort of Keynesian canonical story. So we saw in the previous video this idea that Keynes believed that during recessions, that the money market becomes more sensitive to interest rates, becomes more elastic on the LM side, and then the goods market becomes less reactive to interest rates, and therefore the IS curve, the goods market, becomes steeper. And we saw that in the previous video that if that is the case, if you have a very steep inelastic IS curve and a very flat elastic LM curve, that this seems to suggest that fiscal policy will be better in terms of boosting output. So if we just thinking about policy from the perspective of what's going to get us the largest boost to output, fiscal policy in that scenario is, in a sense, more highly powered than monetary policy. This is, in a sense, sort of the establishment of Keynes' general belief that fiscal policy was the preferred policy mechanism to manage aggregate demand, right? You have to remember, all of this is about aggregate demand management, stabilization policy. And you have two policy spheres to look at. You could look at fiscal policy, you can look at monetary policy. Well, Keynes, especially during economic recessions, thought fiscal policy was better, and we saw that in the previous video. Another sort of reason why Keynes was a little bit down on monetary policy, at least as it relates to boosting the economy, was that he believed that sometimes monetary policy would not be able to boost the economy. So, in particular, that is what we refer to as the liquidity trap. Now, the liquidity trap is very much related to the video you just watched, because you'll notice that in the liquidity trap, when you look at the ISLM graph here to the right, that we have a flat portion of the LM curve. And you'll remember that in the previous video, we argued that during contractions, we expect a flattening of the LM curve, or at least Keynes expected a flattening of the LM curve, and basically the money market becoming extremely responsive in a sense to interest rates. So what does that look like in terms of the construction of the LM curve? Where would that come from? Well, if we look to the right, what we'll find is that what produces a flat LM curve is flat money demand. Right? Typically, money demand is downward sloping, meaning that there is this negative relationship between interest rates and money demand. But during economic contractions, or during economic dysfunction, the money demand curve can go flat, or at the very least, wherever the money supply is, we could be in a flat portion of the money demand curve. And so the idea here is that if you're in the flat portion of the money demand curve and you attempt to run expansionary monetary policy, in this direction, that what you do is you cause no change in the interest rate. So you boost the money supply, but it does not translate into any change in the interest rate ultimately. And so what that would mean is that for increasingly higher levels of output, we get the same interest rate. And then what that also means is that if we are in the flat portion of the LM curve as it relates to the ISLM equilibrium, so here as we see here at Y, then boosting the LM curve via increasing the money supply, expansionary monetary policy, does not lead to any expansion in output. Basically, through the flat portion of the LM curve, the boost to the money supply is going to cause no change in the relationship between interest rates and output, because if we look to the right, we can see that we are in the flat portion of the money demand curve. What does flat mean? Flat means perfectly elastic. That means that if interest rates go up, or technically even down by even 0.5% or a small amount, then there is no money demand. Money demand gets locked in at a particular interest rate. That tends to happen again during economic contractions as people become very precautious in how much money demand they have, and they no longer are sort of making decisions of how much cash to hold and how much money to put in banks based on interest rates, right? In a sense, what's going on here is that people become so worried about the economy that money demand, again, becomes completely unresponsive to interest rates, and therefore monetary policy becomes effectively completely impotent in its ability to grow the economy. And so that's what we see here. Technically, this is shifting the LM curve via the monetary expansion that we illustrate here to the left, but because we're in the flat portion of the LM curve, that shift does not actually translate into any boost in output. And so monetary policy, again, just has no effect on the real economy. What I think is interesting about this particular argument is that I think a lot of economists agree, that this is a fairly classical argument, right? In a sense, this is sort of arguing a fairly Fisherian quantity equation, in a sense, argument, which is that basically you will get to a certain point in your monetary situation, you'll get to a certain point in your macro economy where attempting to increase real GDP via increases in the money supply are just not possible. And then, of course, the sort of larger kind of point here is that when you're boosting the money supply to try to increase, ultimately aggregate demand, and you're getting no increase in aggregate demand, the concern then, therefore, is that that's going to sort of stagnate your economy for a sort of extended period of time. And then eventually what's going to happen is that if your government is, for example, running deficits prior to being in a liquidity trap, which means that ultimately there's perhaps less appetite for fiscal expansion, therefore you start to rely only on monetary policy as a form of economic boost. You're basically going to get nothing out of it. And so we have a really good example of this, and this is the Japanese economy in the 90s and early 2000s. So this is probably the most famous modern liquidity trap. And so the idea is that sometime in the mid 1990s, sorry, it's just for some reason it's very hard to get the right where I want this to be. There we go. Let's do that. And let's do here. So I'll post this paper to the Discord channel. It's not a required paper, but you might be interested in reading it. But basically it kind of does a deep dive into Japan's liquidity trap. And so the liquidity trap in Japan is largely argued that to be starting in the 1990s. And so at that point, Japan is already running essentially really, really low interest rates and sort of continues to run very, very, very low interest rates for really an entire decade. It's the kind of the classic story that, again, Keynes was very concerned about, which was that over time, due to sort of fiscal dysfunction, you would get this over-reliance upon monetary policy. And so basically you would just keep trying to push the money supply out because it's the only way you can boost output. But then at a certain point, you get into a liquidity trap. And now monetary policy is no longer able to boost output. And of course, this is really problematic in Japan because they start experiencing, considerable inflation, right? So really high inflation in the tail end of the 1990s. I'm sorry, excuse me, really high unemployment. I don't know why I said inflation there, but really high unemployment towards the tail end of the 1990s. And we can see that even sort of, post Great Recession, that unemployment rate has not returned sort of back where it was before Japan is thought to have entered this so-called liquidity trap. A consequence of this, basic economics, is that real wages are going to fall. Real economic growth has been declining in Japan. Now, the paper in question where I pulled these images from runs up through 2016. The interesting thing about it is that the sort of idea is that Japan was sort of thought to have exited their liquidity trap around kind of 2014-15. So you'll notice about right here that there starts to be this increase in nominal GDP. Nominal GDP had been stagnant, had sort of declined during the Great Recession, but then there seemed to be started to be this upward trajectory. And I can remember the conversation back then was, Japan is finally coming out of their liquidity trap. And Japan was running very, very large deficits. So they had really had considerable fiscal deficits, but because the economy had been stagnant for so long, revenues had stayed very flat, spending had sort of slightly crept up, so that they continued running increasing fiscal deficits. So in a sense, this is expansionary fiscal policy, and so that liquidity trap starts to sort of show up in the sense that it took a long time for that fiscal policy to seem to work. Then around 2013, 14, 15, we see that, okay, maybe that those deficit spending is starting to really increase things. But then what sort of starts to happen is that there sort of is another kind of stagnation of the Japanese economy. And what's interesting in Japan is that the Bank of Japan, the Central Bank of Japan, has chosen over multiple sessions to actually run negative interest rates. So when we talk about sort of being stuck in this liquidity trap, part of the concern over being stuck in the liquidity trap is that you're going to get your interest rates so low because you're profligate so much in your monetary expansion that there's basically nowhere to go. And the only way to actually try to increase liquidity in your economy even more, if you feel like you need to, is through is through this idea of negative interest rates, which to a lot of people seems quite crazy. To economists, it's really just sort of the nature of real interest rates. So basically, what's going on is that nominal interest rates are near zero. You have a little bit of inflation, right? Real interest rates are nominal minus inflation, so you have negative real interest rates. And the thought, I think, amongst a lot of economists at the time was these negative real interest rates are probably going to be a part of sort of a future growth story. But Japan has, in a sense, continued to seemingly kind of stagnate. Things have kind of continued to sort of flounder to some extent. And so, politically in Japan, you're starting to see some political upheaval. Japan is sort of, currently in the sort of current global economic atmosphere seems to be looking for perhaps new trading partners and maybe some sort of realignment of their economic system. I think the sort of the long and short of the Japanese experience is that the liquidity trap is a very real thing, and I think that now we believe the liquidity trap is even more damaging than we had previously thought it would be. And I think the interesting part about the sort of liquidity trap is that we get into a point where Keynesianism really agrees with one of its main sort of detractors, which is monetarism. Monetarism, of course, we will see, ultimately argues that the central bank should be targeting a money supply, that the central bank should not be targeting an inflation rate or an interest rate. But instead should be targeting a particular money supply. And then, wherever they think the money supply should be, that's where they are using monetary policy to put the money supply to that particular point. And then when you take monetarism kind of even further, you start to get into rules-based monetary policy. So instead of there being sort of this discretion under the central bank, what folks who are highly influenced by Friedman and the monetarists argued that, in fact, monetary policy should be based on a rule. So take the human element, in a sense, completely out of the process. Although, of course, the human would have come up with a model that would have created the rule, but I digress. And so I think the Japanese experience illustrates to us that Keynes, as well as Friedman and the monetarists and the folks that came after, were very right to be concerned about the effect of profligate monetary expansion. To the extent that Friedman was worried about things like inflation or even hyperinflation, versus, say, Keynes, who was more concerned about the liquidity trap's role in creating economic stagnation. In a sense, what you have is the Keynesian liquidity trap argument in the context of Japan seems to make a little bit more sense than the sort of monetarist argument. And so despite the fact that you're sort of being critical of monetary policy here, you're being critical of it not from the perspective of it's going to cause a bunch of inflation, right? But rather, instead, it's not going to lead to long run, a positive long run economic trajectory. So, in a sense, if you don't get your liquidity right in the short run, then it potentially produces long run negative economic consequences. I think that's kind of the big lesson of the liquidity trap idea.